All right, let's begin. We'll begin by praying that this fruits of our learning should be for the release of the hostages and protection of our soldiers and Am Yisrael and all of the innocents.
Amen.
As it happened, I met one of the released hostages last night.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this was like a last minute thing. This is a woman. Oh, here, Michael Werner's coming. It's a woman, Shoshan Haran, who is from Kibbutz Be'eri. She's my age. I looked it up. Um, she was, in this hostage exchange back in November. And is it November? I don't remember. December? I don't remember now exactly when they got out. She is in Washington apparently to plead the case of the hostages to whoever is going to listen. And the wife of the rabbi that hired me has a women's, I don't know what you call it. She has like a women's group. And she got this woman to come and speak at the group. And so the rabbi wanted me to write letters in the Torah for her. As it happened, I was just up to Aseret HaDibrot in Dvarim, so he told me to write appropriately to
No
write.
tignov, right?
No.
Oh. Okay.
Michael, you're too clever by half, as we say. It would not have been inappropriate because Lo Tignov from the Aseret HaDibrot refers to kidnapping, and that is true. And that's the way Chazal understand Lo Tignov. But actually, no, I wrote Asher Hotzeiticha, that I took you out.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Wow.
That was very moving. There's something else I was going to say about that I can't remember. So let's do some learning. Okay, last time we got up to here. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shiurin ve'onshin halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So until now, we're talking about shiurim. We had different discussions regarding shiurim, particularly about Yom Kippur, and then other topics like Tumat Oflin. And now we have Rabbi Yochanan who says shiurim ba'onshin halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Now, if you remember in the last shir, we had this ma'amar, Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was the Talmid Chaver of Rabbi Yochanan, and he said that somebody who eats chaylev bizman hazeh has to write down the shiur that he ate, because maybe a Beit Din will come later and increase the shiurim. And our conclusion of what he meant was that it's possible that in the future, a Beit Din will come and say, instead of a medium-sized kazayit, instead of eating a medium-sized kazayit in order to be chayav v'chatat, you would have to eat more. You would have to eat a large kazayit. That was our conclusion. So one of the things that we saw from his statement is there's this idea then that shiurim are not fixed in some way. In other words, there is some leeway that Chazal have in terms of determining shiurim. Because otherwise, how could he say that in the future Beit Din is going to come along and increase the shiur? So that's what's implied by his statement. So we come now to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says shiurim, right, and punishments, measurements and punishments are halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So as we said, I think we discussed this a little bit last time, right? That if they're halacha Hashem Sinai, then that would mean that the shiurim, it should imply that the shiurim can't be changed. So this would seem to be in opposition to Rabbi Elazar. The Gemara, however, doesn't bring Rabbi Yochanan as a kasha on Rabbi Elazar. We'll have to discuss that. First, the Gemara wants to just understand Rabbi Yochanan on his own terms. So the Gemara says, Gemara asks the question, Onshin michtav k'tiveh. Punishments are written. What does it mean, punishments are written?
They're in the Torah.
They're in the Torah. The Torah tells us what the punishments are. So why should you say that halachah l'Mashem Sinai, which implies what?
That they're not written.
That they're not written in the Torah. So, Ela Hafikam. So rather, this is how you read Rabbi Yochanan. Shiurim shel omshin halachah l'Mashem Sinai. The measurements of punishments are halachah l'Mashem Sinai. So what does that mean?
The minimum amount, the amount beyond which one is chayiv, or at or beyond which one is chayiv.
That doesn't answer my question. You
Maybe I misunderstood your question then.
no, but you're as usual. You're telling me like a half a statement. I don't know what you mean.
Oh, okay. So
No,
the
tell me what these words mean. Shiurim she'onashin halachah l'Mashem Sinai.
So it would be the shiur at or beyond which one is punished.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, excuse me. Yes, okay, yes. I realized I left. I need yes.
You're still only telling me what you think the first three words mean.
Right. Okay, and I just realized that. So basically, these minimums are not. It's suggesting that these minimums, in fact, are not written in Torah. That the minimum, the amount beyond which one is high for punishment.
Okay, so what's the difference? So based on what you're saying, what's the difference between the way we understood Rabbi Yochanan to begin with and the way the Gemara modifies Rabbi Yochanan? In other words, when we said, before you answer, think, but the words of Rabbi Yochanan as they came down to us were shiurin ve'onshin halachah l'Moshe Sinai. So then we challenged that, and we said that the onshin are written, so they can't be halachah l'Moshe Sinai.
Right. Okay. So instead of shiurim and onshin being its base, so it's basically instead of saying that both of them are halachah mimoshe then halachah mimoshe b'Sinai, it's saying that the shiurim base is taking the conjunction to be a preposition.
Michael, you need to say, don't be clever. Tell me.
I'm not being clever.
No, you are. You're not telling me what you just said, what that refers to. What words does that refer to? Tell me what the words mean.
So basically saying, instead of saying that both shiurim and onshin are halach notion in this night, it's saying the shiurim of the measures of punishment, shiurim shel onshim are halachah mimoshe misinai.
Good, simple, simple. No, Michael, you're right. They put in a preposition in between, but you're not, then you're not being explicit. It's very, it's a true, what you say is true. But if you need to explain this to someone or explain it to yourself,
Mhm.
you need to say in a very explicit way what these words mean.
Mhm.
You can't say half sentences. You can't assume that we know the other half of what you're thinking.
Mhm.
Okay, this is true not just for Michael, but it's true for all of you. And I can't emphasize this enough. I can't emphasize this enough. It's really important. However, yes, so the difference now between the way we understood Rabbi Yochanan to begin with is in the beginning we thought shiurim and onashim are two categories of things, which are both halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So then we challenge that because we say the onshin are written in the Torah, so that can't be in the category of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So rather, the way we need to understand Rabbi Yochanan, it's as if it was written shiurim, the shiurim of onshin. That is, the shiurim that are going to bring you to punishment. And then I can add in also some of the things that Michael Werner said. In other words, that what are the shiurim that are punishments? So those will be the minimum amounts that one would need to, in let's say the case of ochlim, the minimum amount of what you need to eat in order to be chayav a punishment. That's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So what it comes out is the onshin are still written, but the amounts, that's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Rashi here says, Hachi Garsina. This is the way we learn the text. This is the text that we are going to use. Onshin michtav tivei, michtav tivei, right, with emphatic, right? So onshin are written. Ela hachi kamar shiurin shel onshin. So that's the girsa that we have in our Gemara, and as I pointed out to you, I'm sure many times by now, Rashi was changing another girsa that doesn't appear in our Gemara, right? Because the people who came after Rashi thought if Rashi changed the girsa, we should change the Gemara. So I'll explain to you in a moment what girsa Rashi was correcting, but that's his girsa. And he explains, what does that mean? Shiurei onashin shal yadohu anush. The shiurim for punishments, that by way of those shiurim, one will be punished. Those shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Be'ez shiur hu anush. They're halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That is, which shiur will bring you to punishment. So, okay. So, before I tell you the alternative that Rashi decided to change, so now we might have a question though. Now we could ask our question about Rabbi Elazar, right? Because Rabbi Elazar seems to think that shiurim, in this case, would be a shiur of onesh, right? So if you eat chaylev, you have to eat a minimum shiur in order to be chayav a chatat. He introduces this idea that could change. So that seems now to be in opposition to Rabbi Yochanan. So that doesn't seem to yet be reconciled in any way. So we're going to leave that as a question for the moment. Let me show you something else. So this is just an interesting thing which I want to show you. Tosfos here and the Tosfos Harosh both talk about the girsa and the girsa that Rashi changed. And I looked on the the Hachi Garcinan website, which has all these alternative girsaot. And out of, I don't know, like a half a dozen other earlier manuscripts or printings, I think there's only one that still had the girsa that was extant before Rashi changed it. So what did Rashi change? So Tosa says, Amshin Michtav Ktive, Hachi Garas Rashi. This is what Rashi, this is the text that he learned. Amshin Michtav Ktive, Aval Bisvarim Haya Katuv, Shiurin Michtav Ktive. In other words, the challenge, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, Shiurin va'Amshin Halacha L'Mashem Sinai. And in earlier Sfarim, the challenge wasn't to Onshin, the challenge was to Shiurim. That Shiurim are written in the Torah. Now, we discussed this, I think, one other time, but where, do you remember where we learned Shiurim are written in the Torah? No, okay.
I remember we discussed it. I don't remember where.
There's a Gemara in Brachos that says we learned that the pasuk of Eretz Chita Usarab and Gefen Tenab Rimam Eretz Shem and Dvash, that those are all references to Shiurim. But what we said at the time was that this is some kind of an asmachta, because even though the Gemara there goes through and says what each of the Shiurim are for, right? Okay, like Zayt Shemin, so Zayit is Kazayit. So we know Kazayit is, let's say, for Yisurei Ochling. But the Gemara also points out that the Torah doesn't tell us, so those are like a list of Shiurim, but it doesn't tell us what the Shiurim apply to. So are the Shiurim really written in the Torah? So, Onshin Michtav Ktivei, Hachi Garas Rashi, Aval B'Sarim Haya Katuv Shiurim Michtav Ktivei, Perush. So what did the Gemara mean when it said Shiurim were written? It means Midah Rabbi Chanan. So that's the Ma'amar of Eretz Chita Usara. Rabbi Chanan said, Eretz Chita Usara, that's a list of all the shiurim that we learn out from the Torah. Amar bePerek Kama de Sukkah. Well, Pasuka zel shiurin ne'amar. Mishane shiurin sha'omshin. So, and then the Gemara answers, no, it's shiurin sha'omshin. Not that the shiurim are written per se, but the shiurim, in other words, the amounts that you would need in order to be chayav and onesh, that isn't written. Because all Rabbi Chanan tells us, again, is that these are shiurim, but it doesn't tell us what they're pertinent for. And I highlighted here, it says, Toso says, V'adin imo. The din, in other words, the decision here is with Rashi. The Logarasle. It's, in other words, Rashi was correct in changing this girsa. Chada, for one reason, Demai Mishane Shiurin Sha'onshin. What difference does it make that it's a Shiurin Sha'onshin? Demikom Makati Tikshilach Shiurin Sha'onshin Miftav Tive. I could still ask the question that that amongst the Shiurim of Rabbi Chanan of Eretz Chita Usora, I still have shiurim that are pertinent to Onshi, and that's written. The whole duchta the parech hachi beperek kama de sukkah de ruvin mighty kol milta Rabbi Chanan. And also, anytime the Gemara asks this question to challenge the idea that shiurim were not written in the Torah, they ask from Rabbi Chanan. In other words, they always bring that quote from Rabbi Chanan as part of the kasha. Here they don't bring Rabbi Chanan. They don't. So it indicates that probably wasn't really the kasha. Because also, they could answer here the way they answered in the other Gemaras where it's brought down that Rabbi Hanan's pasuk of Eretz Vital Sarah is just an asmachta, and I don't really learn out from it. And moreover, I could still ask the kasha but that the onshin themselves, the punishments themselves, are still written. So rather, this all implies that this is not the way the Gemara is asking, that onshin are written, but they're not challenging the idea that shiurim are halakha l'Moshe Sinai, and that they are not written. Because they're relying on the answers that we gave there. In other words, the Gemara, as it were, isn't concerned about this question of whether or not shiurim are actually written in the Torah or not, because it dealt with it in these other sugyot where Rabbi Hanan is brought. So that's a quick explanation of Tosfos. So basically, what's interesting is here, and I'll read you quickly the Tosfos of Rosh, is Tosfos does not always agree with Rashi when Rashi changes Girsa. But here he gives the argument for why Rashi must be correct. So I find that interesting. Tosfos,
Shel,
yes.
why is it so important to know that the shiurim are the Rabbanan or Moshe Sinai, Halakha Moshe Sinai? They are not written either. If they are Halakha Moshe Moshe Sinai, yes. What's the difference? Why is that so important?
Okay, so think about this for a moment. This is a good question. What would be a practical difference between having something explicitly in the Torah or learned out from psukim in the Torah as opposed to halakha l'Moshe Sinai?
No, but even if they are halakha l'Moshe Sinai, they are not written, and well, you have three possibilities: either it's written, or it's halakha l'Moshe Sinai, or it's the Rabbanan. So what's the
practical difference?
Yes, what's the practical difference? Yes.
Okay, so first of all, so this is what I mean. First, let's deal with the question of whether something is considered halakha l'Moshe Sinai as opposed to being michtav k'tiveh, as opposed to being written. So what would be the practical difference between having something written in the Torah as opposed to having it be a tradition from Moshe?
Oral tradition, yes.
Yeah. What would be a practical difference?
I
don't think we've discussed this, so you can tell me whatever you think, and we'll hash it out.
Okay, good. Okay, so I would guess that if it is halakha l'Moshe Sinai, it would be the details might be open to question, but its status is not. Meaning that it has the status of halakha doraita, but the specific details of what that tradition is might be open to question.
As opposed to if it was
if it's actually written in Torah, then well, it's what's written is written.
It's the right, I guess.
Yeah,
that's it's interesting because actually I think it's going to come out almost the flip.
opposite.
Yeah, it's going to be almost the opposite. I'll tell you why. Because our concept of halakha l'Moshe Sinai is, in a sense, it's more ironclad. It's a fixed tradition. The idea is that it's a fixed tradition. Whereas we know when we look at psukim in the Torah, that there are many arguments about how to darshan words in the Torah, and also midot hadrash. Like do I look at like I have Rabbi Ishmael who darshans klal prat, and I have Rabbi Kiva who darshans ribui v'miut, which are similar but not the same concepts. We're looking at the same psukim, at the same words. And I may have mentioned this a long time ago in one of the shiurim, that there's a shiur from Rav Soloveitchik where he answers a particularly difficult question that's brought up about halacha l'Moshe Sinai, where the Rambam, in his introduction to the Perush on the Mishnah, when he talks about halacha l'Moshe Sinai, he says that that there's no machloket about halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That's one of the characteristics of halacha l'Moshe Sinai, as opposed to drashot, where there are plenty of machlokot. So the question on the Rambam is, there are plenty of places in the Gemara where somebody says halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and other people disagree with him.
So there is a machloket.
So there is a machloket. There's a whole tshuva from the Chavot Yair that goes through them. So Rav Soloveitchik answered that question. And the way that what he says is that it doesn't mean that there was never a machloket, but if it comes out in the Gemara, if it comes out from the Beit Midrash, that somebody had a tradition regarding this particular halacha, that it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that meant that stopped the machloket. That was the end of the machloket. It doesn't mean that other people who were cholek, they disagreed because they didn't know there was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But once they knew that was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that was the end of the machloket. And it's part of a much longer shiur that he gave. But if you look, that every time the Gemara says halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that's halacha. It's always halacha. If other people disagreed, the implication is, other people who had disagreed stopped disagreeing once they found out that it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So that's like a quick take. So this is partly why I say that a halacha that is halacha l'Moshe Sinai would seem to be more fixed. It has, in other words, it's not something. It's dafka not based on drash. It's based on an oral tradition that this is halacha. Whereas drash implies that the Torah gave Chazal midot drash, and with the midot drash, it was up to them to decide what the halacha should be from the Torah. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai is like a closed box. This is what it is. This is what it is, and that's something that's immutable. It can't be changed. Something that's d'Rabbanan. This, I'm going to just say something quickly about that because Paul asked, because it gets into a deeper conversation. But dinim that are d'Rabbanan are dinim like takanot u'gzerot, right? So that the Torah, for example, takanot, the Torah doesn't tell us to light Hanukkah candles. So the Chachamim made up a whole category of halacha, which is mitzvot Chanukah. So that's clearly mid'Rabbanan. We also have gzerot. So the gzerot would be, the gader misaviv Torah, right? They're the siag Torah. They're the things that Chazal say you shouldn't do, lest you come to do the Isur D'Oraita. So those are, general. So those are things like yayin nesech and stam yena. The Torah says yayin nesech, you're not allowed to drink the wine of an oved avodah zarah that could be used for avodah zarah. And then later on, they made a gzeirah for different reasons, that you're not allowed to drink the wine of any non-Jew, even if we're not worried about it being used for avodah zarah. So that's a gzeirah, right? And they made a whole series of gzeirot, or is this, I'm trying to remember if it was in this year and another year, but let's say,
so all gderot are gzerot?
yes, those are all gzeirot, and generally speaking, there's also, there's a concept that that the Chachamim were not gozer gzerot, like these kind of siagim in the mikdash. I'm not talking now about stam yena, but I'm talking about certain things that were allowed to be done in the Beit HaMikdash that outside of the Beit HaMikdash weren't allowed to be done because Kohanim is rizim. Chachamim were not worried that Kohanim would be over on mitzvot d'oraita. And so they weren't gozer in the same way inside the Mikdash as they were outside of the Mikdash. So those are all things that are established by the Rabbanan. There's also a, but this is actually, I'm going to bring it back to this because it's pertinent to this discussion about shiurim. So there's also categories of things that where Chachamim, as we've been discussing, so Chachamim also have leeway or have the authority to determine what the Torah means. And those are not necessarily gzerot or takanot, but it's really just understanding what the Torah means, or how the Torah should be, or how the Torah should be implemented. And shiurim might be an example of that. So let's say according to what we learned about Rabbi Elazar says you write down the shiur of what you ate now, the chaylev that you ate now, because maybe Chachamim later on will change the shiur. So that implies that determining the precise amount was up to the Chachamim. And there are other examples of this.
And if it's an halacha Moshe Sinai, they are not allowed to define the quantity, the exact quantity.
So this is now a question. In our sugya, this now becomes a question, because we already saw prior, even before Rabbi Elazar, we had this whole discussion about kekotevet hagasa, and what is that, and what did that mean? Did that mean with including the pit, not including the pit? Was it more than a kibetza? Was it less than a kibetza? So there you could argue that there was a fixed tradition, and the tradition became unclear at some point. And so later Chachamim had to reconstruct it. And we're going to bring an example of that in the Gemara today, just a few minutes. If the shiurim shel onshin are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, so then to understand that in this context, now I have to understand, does that mean the specific shiurim, like the exact amounts? Is it a kazayit agori or kazayit gadol, kazayit katan? One of those is going to be the kazayit that was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Does the halacha l'Moshe Sinai include which specific kazayit it was or not? And that right now is not 100% clear. I'm just going to show you the Tosfos Rosh here, and then we'll go back to the Gemara, and you'll see how some of this fits into the continuation in the Gemara. The Tosfos Rosh, the Rosh, of course, was Rabbeinu Asher, and he had his. There are many Tosfosim. There, right? It's a book which I never honestly read, but it's a very famous book by Professor Tashma called Baalei Tosfot. And it's a big, thick book, and he goes through and he gives the whole history of the Tosfos. Tosfos, of course, wasn't one person; it was many people over many generations.
בעלי התוספות.
Yes, the Baalei Tosfot were many different people, beginning with Rashi's sons-in-law and his grandsons, right? Because Rashi didn't have sons, but he had daughters who were chachamot, and they married Talmidei Chachamim, and his grandsons, particularly Rashbam and the Rabbeinu Tam, and then it continued, for many, many generations after that. So the Rosh is coming in the line of Tosfos, and he has his own version of Tosfos. And in his version of Tosfos, he says it a little bit more explicitly. Onshin michtav tivi hachi garas Rashi aval b'sfarim haya katuv shiurim michtav ktive. Right? He says this was the girsa that Rashi changed. In Rashi's girsa, onshin are written. In the original girsa, shiurim were written. Damar b'yochanan kol pasuk hazel shiurim ne'amar. Because Rabbi Yochanan says in his girsa, it was Rabbi Yochanan as opposed to Rabbi Chanan, that this entire pasuk was written about shiurim, etc. And I highlight this umachako Rashi. Here it's very explicit. Rashi erased it. And again, what's the implication? It wasn't that Rashi was choosing between different svarim that he had. According to the Rosh, and this is implied by what we saw in Tosfos, before Rashi, all of the Svarim had Shiurim Michtav K'tivei. Rashi erased Shiurim, and he wrote Onshin. And he says, why? Mishum dekashle damrinu be'eruhin v'sukkah dekradu Rabbi Yochanan asmachta ba'alma. Because there, the Gemara, when the Gemara quotes this idea that the shiurim are learned out from Eretz Kitao Saura, the Gemara always concludes that that's asmachta ba'alma. V'od amai parich mishiurim tfei me'amshin. Also, why would the Gemara ask a kasha from shiurim more than onshin? Daha inhu v'daiktive. Certainly the onshin are written. So why would they start by asking a question on shiurim, which we know the Gemara is going to conclude anyway that that's just an asmachta. Why doesn't the Gemara bring the entire Ma'amar of Rabbi Yochanan, which is Eretz Chitao Sora, that these are the shiurim, etc. And by the way, as I'm saying this, the Gemara, right? So the Gemara that we saw was, I think, the version that was brought down in Sukkah. No, and I said brachot. But now I'm trying to remember it's also in brachot or not. I don't remember. That might be mine. Anyway, it doesn't matter. All right, this was more, maybe, I just thought this is interesting because this is something that I've always been interested in about how Rashi changed Girsa and how other Rishonim thought of his changing Girsa. So this is one of the cases where it's clear that Rashi changed the Girsa, but in this instance, the people who came after him said that Rashi was correct to change the Girsa. In many other instances, they say, like Rashi shouldn't have changed the Girsa. So, okay, let's go back to our Gemara.
Make sure that I understand.
Mm-hmm.
So if I understand as saying Rashi was correct to change this girsa because it fits better with what is written elsewhere.
It makes, well, I'll put it this way, it works better here, and because based on what we've learned elsewhere, the Gemara here, if the girsa of shiurim would be correct, the Gemara should have brought another couple of lines to challenge that, and then to conclude that it was an asmachta. as it does everywhere else that the Gemara brings that. Now, you can look. I have it on my screen, but I don't have to show you. If you look in the Hachik Sinan, you look at all the different girsaot. There's only one that has this girsa. That may be wrong. Maybe two. There is one girsa which actually brings the whole sugya that Tosfos and Tosfos Rosh say is not brought here. They actually bring that. So, if you understand what I'm saying, it says Shiurin or Michtav K'tive, the Shiurin are written, and then it brings this Ma'amar, whether it's Rabbi Hanan or Rabbi Yochanan, who says, I learn out from Eretz Mitah Sarah all of the Shiurim, and then ultimately the Gemara is going to say Asmachta Ba'alma. Anyway, that's getting a little bit into the weeds. But yeah, basically, the Tosos and Tosos Rosh are saying that if the girsa was like the girsa that Rashi erased, the Gemara would have had at least a couple more lines, because that's what the Gemara always does when this is brought up as an objection. That was one of their objections. Okay. Let's go on now, back in the Gemara. Tanya Nami Hachi. So we learn also in a bright. We learn this also in a Braita. Shiurim shel onashim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So that was our conclusion, right? That Rabbi Yochanan said shiurim v'onashim halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but we conclude that what he meant is shiurim shel onashim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And now I have a Braita that says also shiurim shel onashim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Braita goes on. Acherim omrim, others say, Beit Dino shel Yabetz tiknu. The Beis Din of Yabetz established them. Established what? Established shiurim. So according to the Tanakama of the Braita, second, make my little mark here, just a second. Sense of Braita. So according to the Tanakama, Shiurim Avon Shina Halachan L'Moshe Sinai, but according to Acherim, Beit Dino Shel Yabetz Tiknu. So this is here we actually have an instance where there's a machloket with Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. The Tanakama holds that Shiurim Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, and Acherim hold that no, that they were takana of the Beit Din of Yabetz. So this is one of these cases that would be a challenge to the Rambam, who says that there's no machloket by halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But where does the Gemara conclude? So first of all, the Gemara here is going to challenge Acherim. Gemara says v'haktiv eile hamitzvot shein navi rishai l'chadesh davar me'ata. These are the commandments, and that means that a prophet is not allowed to make something new. What's the word I'm looking for? The chadesh, to innovate. Somebody is prophet is not allowed to innovate anything from here on. Ella, rather, what does it mean? Shachachum v'chazru v'yasdu. They forgot them, and then they went back and established them. Okay. So does this make sense to anybody?
So there were problems with the Girsa already in the Gemara itself.
Yes. Yes. So this is a really interesting thing. This is not the only place where the Gemara talks about this, and I'm gonna try to fit this in now for the rest of the shir to explain this part of the Gemara. So on the one hand, we have the Tanakama says Shiurim Sha'onshin Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, and on the other hand, we have Acherim who say that the Beit Din of Yabetz. So who is Yabetz?
Right. It's written, Otniel ben Knaz.
So Rashi says he's Otniel ben Kenaz. So let's find out a little bit about
Who is Otniel ben Knaz?
well, so wait, we'll come to that. First, let's see what we know about Yabet. So
Now,
Yabet,
when was that Beit Din? At which time did it?
so
That's
this
important again.
well, so this would be in the time like in the early days of Kibush Haaretz. So we'll put this together. First, let's see who Yabetz was. So in Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Perek Daled. So if you've ever learned the beginning of Divrei Hayamim is all these genealogies, right? There's a bunch of genealogies, and it says, who begat who and all of this. We're not going to go through this. It gets quite detailed, and it's one of my goals is to make an easier to read family tree here. But what's interesting is we come to this pasuk, Vayhi Yabetz nichbad me'achav. Yabetz was exalted and honored from more than his brothers. V'imo karashmo Yabetz lemor, and his mother called his name, gave him the name Yabetz, saying Ki yaladati ba'otzev, because I gave birth in distress. Yeah, it's an interesting name. It's reminiscent of Rachel when she gives birth to Binyamin, because she calls him Ben Oni, right? The son of my suffering and my distress. But in any event, then we have this somewhat mysterious pasuk. So first of all, I want to point out when it says Vahi Yabetz Nichbad Me'achav, this is the first time Yabetz is mentioned. In other words, you would think that this is coming after a pasuk where it says that he was born, but it doesn't. This comes like out of nowhere, but presumably he's in this genealogical line that's just before. But it's a little mysterious. And then we have this very mysterious verse, Vayikra Yabetz Elohei Yisrael Lemor, right? He calls out to God, Im barech tevarcheni, v'hirbita et guli, v'ayta yadcha imi, v'asita meira'a levilti atzbi, v'yavel Elokim et asher sha'al. See, he says, if you will surely bless me, and you will make great my border and widen my border, and your hand will be with me, and you will make it so that I am protected from evil, that in order to not be in distress. It's an if statement that has no then, just as if. It's a lashon shvuah, right? This is the way a shvuah is usually taken. What's what I'm trying to think of? Like when Lavan makes an oath with Yaakov, right? That he says, that you can't take. He says you can't take any other wives, beyond my daughters, and it's this lashon of im. Im is often a lashon of shvuah. But in any event, he makes this statement which sounds like a shvuah, but it doesn't say exactly what he's going to do for his part. He just makes a statement, if God does all these things for me. And then it says, Vayivel Elokim et asher sha'al, and God brought that which he requested. So Yabetz must be this interesting person. That he makes this statement, and God fulfills his desire.
When did he live?
So
according to the text.
So according to this text, if you go back and you look to see who we're talking about. So here it starts from Bnei Yehuda, Peretz Chatzon Karmi B'chur V'Shoval, etc. So this goes several generations in the line of Yehuda. So if you count the generations, it's reasonable to say that he would have lived at the time of Yehoshua. Now, why does Rashi say that he's Othniel ben Kenaz? And who was Othniel ben Kenaz? So let's look for a moment at the Gemara. Wait a second. The Gemara here in Tzmura. So there's a larger discussion here in the Gemara. I'm just going to focus in on. Oops, 1 second. That's not what I wanted to click. This is Gufa Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Shoshet Alfim Halachot Nishtaklu Bimei Avlo Shel Moshe. And maybe you know this, and maybe I even brought it up in Shir once. I don't know. It's an interesting tradition that Rav Yehuda says in the name of the Shmuel. 3,000 halachot were forgotten during the mourning period of Moshe. Amru lo Yoshua Sha'al Umarle lo b'shamayim. So then the people. So these 3,000 halachot are forgotten. So the people say to Yoshua, you're a prophet. So ask God. You could ask God. And he answers, Lo b'shamayim. Meaning it's already not in the hands of heaven to determine this. Amru lo l'Shmuel. So then people said they asked Shmuel, right? Shmuel is also a prophet. Marlahem Elah HaMitzvot, Shena Navi Rishaya Chadesh Davar Meyata. And that's the same drasha that we just saw in our Gemara. And we'll discuss that drasha in a moment. Amar B'Yitzchak Nafcha, Af Chatat Shemetu Ba'aleh Nishtaklu Mimei Avlo Shel Moshe. That's a particular halacha that was forgotten in the time of Moshe. What happens to a korban chatat that was mufrash, it was set aside by somebody for their chait, and then they die? What happens to that animal? So that's the question, one of the questions with korban. Amru the Pinchas, so then they asked, the people say to Pinchas, who was also in that generation, Sha'al, you could ask, because he's a Kohen and he has the Urim B'Tumim. And he also says, Lo b'shamayim, Amarei Elazar is a Kohen Gadol. You could ask, Ela mitzvot she'en navi r'shayim hadesh davar miyata. In other words, after Moshe, no one can ask directly or indirectly from the heavens to determine halacha.
How can there be 3,000 halakot if they are only Taryag?
No, 3,000.
Mitzvot.
Right, that's it. So it says halachot. The halachot.
Mitzvot, halachot.
It says shoshet alafim halachot nishtaklu, not mitzvot. And so that's one of them. So that just as an example, they bring one. So the mitzvah chatat, there's a mitzvah that if you do a chait, you bring a korban chatat. We looked at that last week, actually. So, but all of the halachot that are pertinent to that, some of those were forgotten. One of them was, what if somebody was mafrish chatat and then they died? What do you do with the chatat? So that's a halacha. It's not a mitzvah unto itself. It's just a halacha. So the Gemara goes on. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav B'shah sheniftar Moshe Rabbeinu leGan Eden. At the time Moshe passed away and went to Gan Eden. At the time he was in other words, this is the time when he's just about to die. Amarlo the Yoshua, he says to Yoshua, Sha'almi meni kol svekot sheyesh lecha. Ask me anything that you have doubts about. In other words, I'm going to be gone. He knows that he's dying. So he says, this is your last chance. So, Marlo, Rabbi, klum hinachticha sha'achat. Did I leave you for even one moment? The halachti l'makom acher, to go somewhere else? Lo kach katav tavi. Didn't you write this about me in the Torah? U'misharto Yoshua bin Nun na'ar lo yamish mitocha ohem. right? It says in Shmos that Yeshua never left the Ohel of Moshe. Yad tashash kocho she Yoshua, v'nishtakhu mimenu shalosh meot halachot, v'noldu lo shva meot tzvekot. So, right after he says that, his strength weakens and he forgets 300 halachot, and then he had 700 more svekot. V'amdu kol Yisrael v'hargo. All of Israel wants to kill him. Amar la HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lomar lach, efshar lach v'tordan v'milchama, shneamar v'yi acharei mot. So Kadosh Baruch Hu says, it's as if to say, to tell you, you can't do this. And then tordan v'milchama. And then he got them busy with war, right? After Moshe dies, yeah, Yeshua forgets all these things, but God says, you can't handle this, but I'll take your mind off it and you'll go to war. B'matnitin tana elef u'shvamiot kalin v'chamurin gzerot shavot v'diktukei sofrim nishtakhu b'mei avo shel Moshe. In a Braita, we learned that there were 1,700 kalin v'chamurim, like kal v'chomers, right? Limudim of kal v'chomer, and zerot shavot, right? These are different midot hadrash. That there were 1,700 examples of these different kinds of drashot that were lost, and diktukei sofrim. Diktukei sofrim is separate discussion. It had to do a little bit with what we were talking about before, but let's say the particular way that Rabbanan read the Torah. These were forgotten during the mourning period of Moshe. Then Amar B'Yaval, Afal Pichein, even so, Hechziran Otniel ben Kenaz mitoch pilpulo. Otniel ben Kenaz restored all of these lost halachot and all of these svekot. He restored them from his sharpness. Shenamar v'yilkedu Otniel ben Kenaz achi kalev v'yiten lo achsa bito leisha. Okay, so there's this idea that Otniel ben Kenaz, who was the son-in-law, who became the son-in-law of Kalev, that he restored all of these halachot. And it comes from the Gemara here, it goes on, they darshan from these psukim. And because I have limited time today, I'm not going to go through all this. It's quite interesting because they take this story about Achsa and they weave it in. They weave that in and they weave in other things to say that this is all implied in Sefer Yoshua that Otniel ben Kenaz restored all of these halachot. V'kalev ben Kenaz. Okay, I'm going to skip this down. And finally, it says Tana hu Otniel hu Yabetz. When it says Otniel was Yabetz, the Yabetz that we just saw in Divrei Hayamim, that's the Otniel ben Kenaz that's mentioned in Sefer Yoshua. Uma Shemo, Yehuda Achi Shimon Shemo. His real name was Yehuda, the brother of Shimon. Why was he called Otniel? Sha'ana'o El, because God answered him. Yabetz she'ya'atz ribeitz Torah b'Yisrael, because he advised and he spread Torah throughout Israel. So he had these different names. So in the midrashic mindset, Otniel is Yabetz. So what do we know though about Yabetz / Otniel ben Kenaz? That he was this incredibly sharp guy who, after Moshe died, and all kinds of, we see different versions of what happened, but all kinds of halachot were lost, were forgotten. So he restored them through his, through the sharpness of his mind. In other words, he figured them out. So, first of all, there's a lot to be said about this. It implies, what does that imply about the nature of halachot, the nature of Torah?
So you have got a lot of halachot LeMoshe Sinai, which went through a very unclear channel to go into.
Well, okay.
Until they were
Well,
reported to us or to Chazal, let's say.
Well, okay, so I want to hold on that point for a moment, but it tells you something about the way Chazal understood the nature of halacha, that these halachot that Moshe had received at Sinai, even after they were forgotten, and what would we think about like halachot l'Moshe? It doesn't say halachot l'Moshe Sinai, but that is the implication. These are halachot that Moshe knew and that were forgotten, and now they're restored. Now they're restored not because anybody remembered them, but through learning, right? Through the process of learning, they were restored. So it tells you something about the nature of these halachot, that within the Torah system, they could be restored. You might say that halakha l'Moshe Sinai are things that don't necessarily have to make any kind of sense. So, for example, I mean, I'll give you an example of halakha l'Moshe Sinai. A lot of hilchot tefillin are halakha l'Moshe Sinai. That ritzuot shchorot is halakha l'Moshe Sinai, and the ribua of the titura is halakha l'Moshe Sinai. Shin shel tefillin halakha l'Moshe Sinai. So these seem to be arbitrary rules that we got from Halacha Moshe Sinai. So if they're arbitrary, how can they be restored? So there's an implication, though, that within the framework of Torah, even those halachot, which might seem random or arbitrary, are so inherently part of Torah that you can use other tools of learning to restore them. It's a very interesting concept that's being assumed here.
So they are not arbitrary.
So they're not arbitrary, but the reason I say,
because you can restore them, so
they're not, they can't be arbitrary. But the only thing I add is that it means within this framework of the Torah. So if you come completely outside the framework of the Torah, it's not necessarily the same as natural law. It's not something that you might come up with under any culture, any system. But if you have Torah writ large, which also includes Midot Hadrash, it includes different ways of learning, and you have Torah Shebichtav, you always have, and you have other frameworks within which to learn, then in principle you can restore all of the Torah. There are other examples of this idea in the Gemara, but this is one of the most outstanding. So what we see is that, there's this idea that, as Paul mentioned, so you could have something that's halakha l'Moshe Sinai that could be forgotten, and then it could be restored. So let's go back now and see, with this understanding, we have a little bit more understanding of our Gemara. So the Gemara had concluded from Rabbi Yochanan, Shirim shel onashin halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Tanya nami hachi. So I also learned it in the Braita. Shirim shel onashin halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Acherim omrim beit dino shel yabetz tiknu. So on the face of it, this is a machloket between the Tana Kama and Acherim. The Tana Kama says the shiurim halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and Acherim says actually they were takana of the Beit Din of Yabetz, which would imply that they're altogether midrabanan. V'haktiv el hamitzvot shein navi rishai lechadesh davar miata. We have to discuss this drasha, but I'm going to hold it just for another moment. Ella, right? So, but it's a challenge to this idea that somebody could have come along and be mitzakein things that were not explicitly written in the Torah. Ella shachachum v'chazru v'yastum. Rather, it means they forgot them, and then they went back and they established them. So, to put it all together, it means there isn't really a machloket between a chayrim and the Tanakama. It's just that the Tanakama says shirim of onshin v'halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and the chayrim is just telling us what happened. They were halacha l'Moshe miSinai, they were forgotten, and now we can hook that back up to the Gemara we just saw in Tzumura. They were probably forgotten. They must have been among the halachot that were forgotten during the mourning period of Moshe. And Yabetz, and now we understand why Rashi, right, brings this little tidbit that Yabetz is Otniel ben Kenaz. He's the one that we saw in the Gemara, in Tzumura, who said, who came back and he was able to restore. So everybody agrees that actually they are halacha l'Moshe miSinai, but they were forgotten for a while and then they were restored.
So what's the difference between psika and shihzur?
Well,
you can always say that אני פוסק ככה, בגלל שמתוך ההיגיון אני משחזר שככה זה צריך להיות.
So first of all, I'm going to start off by saying there's a presumption of integrity on the part of Chazal that they but okay, but that's no, but there will be a difference because this is the point you're raising is something that has honestly fascinated me for most of my life. It's this idea that it indicates actually that Chazal were very particular. In other words, because Chazal don't come along and say, this is what the Torah means when all they want to do is to make a gzeirah. In other words, they themselves differentiate between their gzeirot and their takanot and the way they understood what the Torah actually said. So there is a difference. But having said that, I have to point out that in later generations, there were sometimes machlokot about whether a din that came down was a din d'oraita or a din d'Rabbanan. That really happens. I'm sure I brought this up before, but I'm going to leave that for the moment. But it indicates there's this idea that that tradition can get broken, right? Shachachum tells me the tradition is broken. But what keeps it together, what keeps it flowing, is the potential for reinstatement, the potential for reestablishing something that had been. So let's say in this case, maybe this is more to the point of what you're asking. Think about the way the story is told. After Moshe dies, everybody knows that that halachot have been forgotten. So when Otniel ben Kenaz comes and he restores them, it's clear he's not making up something new. He must, because it's not the same as coming after Moshe died and Yeshua saying, there were 3,000 halachot that Moshe told me that he never told you. And now I'm going to tell you, and now I'm going to tell them to you. All right. So there's a whole system about why that would never have happened, but it's not the same. Everybody knows that there are 3,000 or whatever, 1,700 different versions of that. All these halachot or svekot, arise, that they're forgotten or whatever. And so people know that there's something missing. And the basic sense of that is going to be like even now when you have a safek lahalacha. So there might be a halacha that you simply don't know, but if you if you open up a Mishnah Brura, maybe the Mishnah Brura will tell you the answer. Or maybe there's halachot that are not explicit anywhere. And then you have to go and ask for a psak. Maybe you have to go to a Beit Din. And then they have to discuss it, and they have to say this way or that way until they finally come to a conclusion. So in the first instance, there was a known halacha that you simply didn't know, that everybody agreed on. And in the second instance, you may be raising a question that had never before been judged. And now you have to figure out a way of answering that. So this is the first case, this idea of shachachum v'chazun v'yastum. Those are halachot that were known, but then they were forgotten. So everybody knew they existed. And like the Gemara brings that example of chatat shemetu ba'aleh, seder. So everybody knows that's a real question. Those are questions that really come up. So it's not a whole new category of halacha. It just means in this set of halachot, there are certain specific halachot that we don't know anymore. So, yeah. So wait, let's because we really are running out of time. I want to just discuss for a moment the drasha of Eila HaMitzvot. And if I have time, I'll show you another example of shachachum v'yastum. There's another, it comes up elsewhere in the Gemara. But let's take a moment and look at the pasuk. So this is the very end of Vayikra. So mamash the very, very end of Vayikra, the last pasuk. Eila hamitzvot asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe el bnei Yisrael b'har Sinai. That's the pasuk in question, and I'm going to assume that the Torah Tzimim here is going to bring it. Yeah. Ela mitzvot, mikan shein hanavi rishayach hadesh davar me'ata. This is, from here we learn that a Navi cannot come along and innovate anything from now on. In other words, so this is what, now how it's learned out, we'll look in a second, in a moment, at the way the Torah Tzimim learns it out. It's learned out. Well, okay, I'll let him say. But this is what distinguishes the Nevuah of Moshe and all the other Nevi'im. Or it's one of the distinguishing factors. Moshe's Nevuah was the Torah. That's his Nevuah. Nobody else can come along and have another Nevuah of Torah. That's basically what this drasha means. There's only one Torah. Other Nevi'im who come along can't come along anymore and say, I had a Nevuah from God, and he said to do this mitzvah or that mitzvah that we never heard of before, or to cancel mitzvot that are written in the Torah. Eila ha-mitzvot. These are the mitzvot. That's it. This is the end of the line for mitzvot. So yeah, as I had it has a very long discussion here about how the drasha learns, and I don't have time to go into my own understanding of it. But what's interesting is if you look at the end of Vayikra, beginning from a couple of parshas back in Bahar, Parshat Bahar begins with Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Bahar Sinai Lemor, right? That's Parshat Bahar begins, and it has those words Bahar Sinai. It takes the standard pasuk Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, but it inserts those two words of Bahar Sinai. And so there's a famous Rashi there, there's this famous Ramban there. And Rashi bases himself on Chazal, but this is to teach you that just like all of the particulars of the mitzvah of Shemitah were learned at Sinai, because that's what the Torah talks about. So it is with all the mitzvot. All the mitzvot were learned in all of their particulars at Sinai. But it starts off this unit in Vayikra, Bahar Sinai, which ends here by saying El HaMitzvot Asher Tzivah Hashem Moshe Bnei Yisrael Bahar Sinai. It's from one Bahar Sinai to the other Bahar Sinai, and I'm gonna leave it at that as food for thought, that it creates a unit and tells you something about the nature of the way Torah was given at Sinai. So Chazal understood that one of the points is that there's only one Torah, and that's the Torah that was received in Har Sinai. In the last minute,
Although it seemed to be that both Eliyahu and Yehezkel seemed to innovate.
seemed to, in what way?
Well, I mean, Eliyahu and Carmel.
Right.
Does
So what do Chazal say about that? So what's
actually,
the
I believe that we
what's the
discussed.
innovation? What's the innovation? What does he do on Har Carmel
Well, he brings a korban on Har Carmel as opposed to
as opposed to what?
As opposed to in Jerusalem.
Right.
Or
In other
Shiloh.
words, there's a misur for him to bring a korban outside of the Beit HaMikdash. There's a misur.
And actually, now they mention, I think we did discuss this, and the reasonings that this is just a one-off.
It was a one-off. In other words, Chazal understood that to be a hora'at sha'ah. It was a psak just for that moment, and it introduces the idea that in certain exceptional cases, a posek, in other words, Eliyahu, from Chazal's point of view, Eliyahu's decision to bring a korban on Har Carmel, he didn't do that in his position as a Navi. He did that from the position of a posek. He was also Talmid Chacham, and he was doing a Hora'at Sha'ah for reasons that were pertinent at that time. But it's a good point. It's exactly the question that should be raised. And then with Yechezkel, we have all kinds of other issues where Yechezkel seems to contradict things in the Torah. And so famously, in the first parak of Shabbos, we know that, and now it escaped me the name, but one of the Tanaim sat down to write a perush to Sefer Yechezkel to explain all of the contradictions. But the conclusion there also is that Yechezkel didn't really contradict the Torah, and so he also wasn't innovative. We also have from elsewhere in the Gemara this idea. The Gemara says in Baba Kama, Divrei Kabbalah Divrei Torah Divrei Kabbalah lo yafina. We don't learn Divrei Torah. In other words, we don't learn about mitzvot d'oraita from Divrei Kabbalah. Divrei Kabbalah are Nevi'im. They had the tradition. We don't learn Torah from the Nevi'im. However, we can learn definitions of. We can learn definitions of terms from Nevi'im. We can learn certain practical aspects of halakha from Nevi'im. But this is a very basic concept that Chazal held, that there was one Torah that Moshe received, and that was it. That's the only Torah. Everything else is essentially either a commentary or some kind of commentary or explication on the Torah of Moshe. And then, yes, we have these cases of exceptions. But I'm going to have to stop here. And maybe we'll discuss this a little bit more next time. But otherwise, we'll go on to the next part. Now we're going to go up to the part of the Gemara that talks about drinking, right? Until now, we talked about the shiur of eating. Now we're going to talk about the shiur of drinking. We'll do that hopefully next time, which will be in 2 weeks.
So you're flying back presently, no?
Well, I'm going to leave Washington on Monday. I will be in Greece Tuesday night and Wednesday night.
Very nice.
And then I'll be back in Israel, God willing, by Thursday night. So I don't assume that I'm going to be able to give shiur next Wednesday. So we will meet again in 2 weeks.
In Israel, in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem, Bezrat Hashem. Yes, and then those of you who are in Jerusalem, we could discuss the possibility of actually meeting up at Yakar, but we'll leave
What a
that
concept.
later. We'll leave that for a later discussion. Okay. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Good night, thank you. Nisiya tova.
נסיעה
Good
טובה.
night.
Good night.
Enjoy your mini vacation too, Anurag.